Hi guys, welcome to lesson 9.5, completing the square. Our objective for today is that I can solve quadratic functions by completing the square. So in general, you can change the expression x squared plus bx into a perfect square trinomial. This process is called completing the square. Ignore my poor editing. All right, so completing the square creates a perfect square trinomial by adding the quantity b over 2 squared to x squared plus bx. All right, so we're trying to find a c value that is going to make these a perfect square trinomial. All right, so if you'll remember when we had our special case of x plus 4 squared, and we said it was x squared plus 2 times 4 times x, and then it was plus 4 squared. Well, in order to get that 4 squared, this is what we're trying to find, this term, whatever this is going to be. We need to divide our b term by 2 to get rid of the 2 there, and then we would just be left with the 4 that we square to give our c value. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So we're going to follow this formula that's right here, b over 2, the quantity squared, and we're going to figure it out. So we have negative 16 over 2 squared. Negative 16 over 2 is negative 8. Negative 8 squared. Negative 8 squared. And remember, this should be put in parentheses when we put into our calculators. And so we end up with 64. So C equals 64 for problem A. Okay, and that would be a perfect square trinomial then, right? So if we had x squared minus 16x plus 64, if we factor that, we're going to get x minus 8 squared. Okay, so we're adding some value in to make it a perfect square trinomial, which is what we have right there. Here's a hint, guys. When we go to do our factoring, whatever this is, this b over 2, that is going to be what you put in for the second term in your trinomial, right? Because it's negative 8 times negative 8 when we FOIL it, so that would give us a positive 64. The other thing is your c value that you add will always, 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 always be positive, because any number squared is going to be a positive number. So for problem number B, so we got c is equal to the b, which is 20, over 2 the quantity squared. So 20 divided by 2 is 10, so that's 10 squared, which is equal to 100. So if we do that, we've got x plus 10, the quantity squared, as our factored form. Okay? All right. Letter C, we have x squared plus 6x plus c, so we do the quantity 6 over 2 squared. 6 over 2 is 3. 3 squared is 9. So you have x squared plus 6x plus 9. And we can factor that, right? Perfect square trinomial, it's x plus 3, the quantity squared. I want you guys to try letters D, E, and F on your own, and then I will go over them. So letter D, we have x squared minus 7x plus c, so we do 7 over 2 squared, which is going to just be, we'll leave that as a fraction and we'll square it. So that's 49 over 4, which if we wrote as a decimal would be 12.25. You don't have to write it as decimal, you could just leave it as the improper fraction. So it would be x squared minus 7x plus, we'll go with the fraction, 49 over 4. So when you factor that, you get x minus 7 halves, the quantity squared. Okay. All right. Next up, letter E. We have x squared plus 22x plus c. So we do 22 over 2, the quantity squared, which is equal to 11 squared. Perfect square rules, 121 is 11 squared. So x squared plus 22x plus 121. And we get x plus 11, the quantity squared. Letter F, forgot the plus c there, so we'll just add it right in. So we have negative 14 over 2, the quantity squared. Negative 14 divided by 2 is negative 7, the quantity squared, which is 49. So x squared minus 14x plus 49. And when we factor, it's x minus 7, the quantity squared. Okay. Now, moving down to problem 2. Solving x squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So now we're putting these into an equation. And the way to do completing the square in an equation, our first step is to subtract the constant from both sides, and then we do the completing the square process and add that value that we come up with to both sides of our equation. And from there, we can isolate our x and solve the equation. Okay, so let's just start with that process. Our first step is going to be to subtract 16 from both sides of our equation. And so we get x squared minus 14x. Now I'm going to leave a space here for when I complete the square. And it's equal to negative 16. Now up at the top here, I am actually going to go through the process of completing the square. So I'm not going to show all the steps that we showed up here because we can do these in our calculator. Just type in parentheses 22 divided by 2, the quantity squared, and parentheses squared. It'll do all the work for you. Okay, so we have negative 14 over 2 squared. Negative 14 divided by 2 is negative 7. Squared is 49. So what we're going to add to this equation is plus 49. But if you remember our equality rules from the beginning of the school year, when we add something to one equation, we need to do it to the other. So I'm going to add 49 to the other side of the equation, to the other side of the equal sign, in order to keep this true. So now when I go and do this, I'm going to factor x squared minus 14x plus 49. That was going to be x minus 7, the quantity squared. And that's going to be equal to negative 16 plus 49 is 33. So my next step is going to be to take the square root of both sides. So the square root of squared, they cancel out. They are opposite operations. So I get x minus 7 equals plus or minus 5.74. Okay. And when I do 7 plus the square root of, we split that into our two equations to come up with our final answers. X minus 7 equals positive 5.74, and x minus 7 equals negative 5.74. We add 7 to both sides of our equation in both equations. So x is going to be equal to, when we add it, it's going to be equal to 12.74. And when we subtract it, x is going to be equal to 1.26. Okay? And we can just round off these when we get irrational answers. Okay? All right. Letter B, and I'm just going to put a little divider line here because our work is going to bleed over a little bit. Letter B. first thing to do is to subtract 15 from both sides. So I'm going to do that. Minus 15 minus 15. So I get x squared plus 9x equals negative 15. And now I'm going to do the completing the square process. So I have 9 over 2, the quantity squared, which is going to give me 20.25. Okay, so I'm going to add that in here. Plus 20.25 plus 20.25. Okay. Do the addition and do my factoring. So x squared plus 9x plus 20.25. Remember that hint that whatever is inside the parentheses here is going to be what your second part of your binomial is. So we're going to do plus 9 halves, that's just 4.5. And that's the quantity squared, equals negative 15 plus 20.5 is 5.25. So our next step then is to take the square root of both sides of our equation. And I get x plus 4.5 is equal to plus or minus, and I'm rounding here, 2.29. If you're just using your calculator, you can just do, you could use the square root of 4.25 in the calculator in the moment. So what I would do is, I can show you that right now. So we have x plus 4.5 equals positive 2.29. The x plus 4.5 equals negative 2.29. Okay. And so let's just show what that would look like. It would look like you could do the square root of 5.25 minus 4.5, because that's what we're going to have to do to solve these. We're going to subtract 4.5. And so you would get negative 2.21. So you get x equals negative 2.21. So that's one of your answers. And then if you have the negative square root of 5.25 minus 4.5, you get negative 6.79. Okay? All right, I would like you guys to try letter C on your own, and then I will go over it. All right, so first step is to add 20 to both sides. So n squared plus 12n, leave my space, equals 20. I do my completing the square, so 12 over 2, the quantity squared. 12 divided by 2 is 6. 6 squared is 36. So I add 36 to both equations, or both sides of the equation, rather. And I can factor this, because I know it's a perfect square, n plus 6, quantity squared, equals 56. Take the square root of both sides, and so I get n plus 6 equals, square root of 56 is plus or minus 7.48. So I have n plus 6 equals 7.48. n plus 6 equals negative 7.48. Subtract 6 from both sides. N equals 1.48, and n equals negative 13.48. All right, believe it or not, that is the end of our notes for this lesson. Completing the square can be a little bit complicated. It can be a little time-consuming. It can be a little awkward and complex. I get that. We understand it. This is one of those lessons that we are going to need to do a lot of practice on. So in class tomorrow, make sure that you are truly doing the in-class assignment that we give you and truly practicing this skill, because as I said, it takes time to get good at it. All right, I made this look pretty easy. Again, I've been doing algebra since you guys have been born. So Make sure you write down any questions or confusions that you have on this lesson so that Mrs. Zierzo and Mr. Wolf and I can get to you and address those questions and help you out and clarify. Write down a summary of what it means to complete the square. So this could be the process of completing the square or how to use it to solve. Okay, that's our lesson for today. Have a great night.